Chapter 4. A village divided in 1692, Salem did not implode all at once. The calamity of the witch trials was not a thunderclap, but the slow ignition of long-standing tensions, suspicions, and grievances. For decades, Salem village had been perched on a precipice. The trials merely gave it the final push. To understand the madness that overtook the community, one must first understand the fractures that had long been running through it. Salem village was, in many ways, a place defined by division. Unlike Salem town to the south, a thriving commercial hub tied to maritime trade, the village was rural, agricultural, and economically modest. Its inhabitants tended livestock, worked small farms, and lived far from the bustling port economy that made some of their southern neighbors wealthy and cosmopolitan. That gap created not just an economic divide, but a cultural one. Village residents saw Salem town as indulgent, worldly, and morally lax. Town residents, in turn, regarded the villagers as rigid, backwater zealots. The friction between these two communities was more than a clash of geography. It was a contest of identity, of values, and of power. Nowhere was this more evident than in the village's struggle for ecclesiastical independence. For years, Salem village had fought for the right to hire its own minister and maintain its own meeting. Separate from Salem town's oversight, these efforts were met with repeated resistance. Ministers came and went, often leaving under clouds of scandal or conflict. The inability to keep spiritual leadership stable fed into the perception that the village was spiritually fertile ground, perhaps for the devil's work. By the time Reverend Samuel Parris arrived in 1689, the village was deeply fragmented. Some supported him, others despised him. He demanded not just religious obedience, but material support, including the deed to the village parsonage and surrounding land. Parris's sermons were harsh and unforgiving. He preached often of the devil, of hell, and of divine judgment. And when strange things began happening in his own home, many in the village were already poised to see supernatural explanations. But the religious and geographic fractures were only the surface. Beneath them churned a complex web of interpersonal feuds, generational disputes, and legal grievances that had persisted for decades. Families like the Putnams and the Porters were locked in long-standing rivalries. The Putnams, strong supporters of Parris and deeply tied to the agrarian economy, frequently clashed with the more commercially minded Porters, whose wealth and influence extended into Salem town. Their disputes were not merely philosophical, they were personal, political, and often litigious. Deeds and property lines became weapons in a quiet war that had been waged through town meetings, court filings, and whispered accusations. When Reverend Parris's own sermons began to hint at dark forces at work in the village, it was not hard for his allies to interpret these spiritual dangers as emanating from their social enemies. In this context, the trials were not a descent into chaos. They were a calculated settling of accounts. When the accusations of witchcraft began, these family feuds provided the scaffolding for their spread. Many of the first accusers were members or allies of the Putnam family. Many of the accused were connected in some way to the Porters, or had at one time opposed Parris, or had challenged the social order. In this light, the witch trials began to resemble something other than a spiritual purge. They looked increasingly like a political coup. The role of land cannot be overstated. Salem village was a place where property determined power. Boundaries and ownership were matters not just of wealth, but of identity. Generational disputes over inheritance, unclear deeds, or contested plots created long memories and deep resentments. The legal disputes that had dragged through local courts for decades found new resolution in the trials, not through judges or juries, but through the gallows. Gender, too, played a central role in the dynamics of accusation. Women who existed outside the narrow expectations of Puritan womanhood were especially vulnerable. A wife who questioned her husband's authority, a midwife whose patients died in childbirth, or a widow who managed her own affairs without male oversight. All were threats to the social order. In a culture obsessed with submission and obedience, independence was easily mistaken for rebellion. Rebecca Nurse was not poor, nor was she politically outspoken. She was, by all appearances, a model of piety and grace. But she had one strike against her. She came from a family embroiled in land disputes with the Putnams. When she was accused, many in the village were stunned. Petitions circulated in her defense, but fear was stronger than familiarity, and the court was already committed to its path. Her execution marked a turning point. If Rebecca could hang, anyone could. The crisis also laid bare generational conflict. The accusers were largely young, many teenagers, some younger. Their parents had raised them in a world of strict religious codes, rigid hierarchies, and harsh consequences. The courtroom became a strange inversion of that world. Young girls were now the voices of authority. Adults quailed before them. Men of standing begged for their mercy. For a brief season, the powerless became powerful, and they wielded that power with unflinching certainty. The spectacle of the trials, the screaming fits, the fainting, the visions, was not merely drama. It was theater with real consequences. The courtroom became a stage upon which guilt was not proven but performed. And in that performance, the fractures of Salem came into sharp focus. Class against class, family against family, generation against generation. The anxiety that crept through Salem was not limited to courtrooms and gallows. It infected the daily rhythm of life. The fields, the hearths, the taverns, and the church pews. Farmers no longer exchanged pleasantries at boundary fences. Children were warned not to speak too freely. Entire families relocated to escape the stain of association. The very air in the village seemed charged with accusation. In such a world, neutrality became complicity. One either sided with the accusers or risked being counted among the accused. When neighbors hesitated to affirm the claims of afflicted girls, that hesitation itself could be interpreted as guilt. When townspeople remained silent during a public confession or execution, their silence bred suspicion. People learned to cheer loudly, to condemn quickly, to accuse preemptively, not out of conviction, but survival. It was this crucible of fear that transformed minor slights into mortal offenses. A borrowed kettle returned late, a cow found dead in the pasture, a sour loaf of bread. Each event became a potential omen. A woman who glanced too long at a baby was suspected of cursing it. A man who plowed his fields on a Sunday, though forbidden, was said to have struck a pact with the devil. Old grudges found new form, reshaped into testimony and sealed with tears. The church, meant to be a sanctuary, was instead a stage. The pulpit thundered with sermons, not of grace, but of fire. Ministers spoke less of redemption and more of vigilance. The enemy was not out there. It was within. Sermons drew sharp lines between the elect and the damned. Those who had once been pillars of the congregation were now cast as traitors to the covenant, and the line between God's justice and man's revenge grew thinner by the week. Even the natural world became suspect. Unseasonal frosts, dying livestock, strange lights in the sky, all were interpreted as signs of spiritual contamination. The Puritan worldview had always seen the material world as a reflection of divine order, but now, that order seemed broken. The trials were not only about rooting out witches, they were an attempt to restore the balance of the universe itself. And yet, there were voices of resistance. Quiet ones, fragile ones, but they existed. Some villagers wrote anonymous petitions. Others whispered to trusted friends of their doubts. A few, like Mary Easty and John Proctor, spoke openly of their innocence, even as they marched toward death. These voices did not stop the trials, but they marked the moral boundary that others had crossed. There were also those who attempted to use reason. Magistrates from neighboring towns expressed concern. Reverend Increase Mather, whose son Cotton had publicly supported the trials, began to shift his stance. He cautioned against the use of spectral evidence and warned of the dangers of convicting without physical proof. His argument, that it was better for 10 witches to go free than for one innocent person to die, was a rare voice of restraint in a chorus of panic. But Salem had become too loud to hear such reason. The machinery was already moving. Testimonies were gathered, confessions recorded, gallows raised. The institution of the trials had taken on a momentum all its own. To question it now was not only to challenge the court, but to challenge God. As more people were imprisoned, the social fabric continued to tear. Families were left without breadwinners. Farms went untended. Children were orphaned or forced into servitude. The jails overflowed, and the economy sagged under the weight of disrupted labor and mounting costs. The price of justice was not just lives, it was livelihood. And still, the names came. Still, the accusations spread. The village was no longer a community. It was a battlefield without weapons, a war without armies. And though the gallows would one day fall silent, the divisions carved by those ropes and judges would not fade, so the psychological toll of the trials left invisible scars that outlasted the physical evidence. Survivors bore the weight of silence, having seen friends hanged or family imprisoned. Children grew up in households that refused to speak of the events, while others internalized their parents' shame or the community's suspicion. The Puritan code that demanded moral clarity provided no salve for grief born of betrayal. Some villagers attempted to move forward by reinforcing the very institutions that had failed them. They doubled down on religious observance, hoping to purify their souls and their settlements. Weekly sermons were lengthened, fasting days increased, and town meetings reopened. Old debates about appropriate conduct. Others withdrew entirely from civic life, refusing to take communion, attend public worship, or serve on juries, unable to reconcile participation with the memory of injustice. New ministers faced the daunting task of rebuilding fractured trust. Reverend Joseph Green, who succeeded Paris, made overtures of reconciliation. He welcomed back those who had been excommunicated, visited imprisoned villagers who had since been released, and even invited public discussions about healing. His efforts were not always welcomed. For many, the wounds were too fresh, the confessions too late, and the memories too sharp. Yet Green persisted. In one of his most symbolic gestures, he invited the surviving members of the nurse and proctor families to sit in the front pews of the meeting house. It was a powerful reversal of roles. Those once judged were now honored. Though no sermon could restore what had been taken, small acts like these helped begin the long and bitter road toward communal restoration. At the same time, the intellectual class of New England ministers, magistrates, and educators began a more subtle reckoning. The questions that haunted Salem would not disappear. How could such evil be done in the name of good? How could God's will have been interpreted so disastrously? Scholars turned to theology, philosophy, and law to dissect the trials, giving rise to new attitudes toward evidence, confession, and jurisprudence. Cotton Mather, once a fervent supporter of the trials, grew more nuanced in his later writings. Though he never fully repudiated his role, his reflections suggested discomfort. In contrast, Increase Mather became more vocal, arguing in published sermons and treatises that reliance on spectral evidence was a grave theological and legal error. These debates rippled beyond Salem, influencing colonial law and even seeding early notions of legal reform. Outside of Salem, neighboring communities watched the chaos with a mix of horror and relief. Some towns had narrowly avoided their own outbreaks of accusations, and they took precautions to prevent a similar descent. Local magistrates in towns like Andover and Ipswich grew increasingly cautious, questioning accusers more sharply and refusing to admit spectral evidence. In doing so, they helped to draw the line that would eventually end the crisis. But drawing that line came at a cost. Many of the accusers, once seen as brave truth-tellers, were now viewed with suspicion. Some fled the region, while others lived under a cloud of discomfort. The afflicted girls, Ann Putnam Jr., Merce Lewis, and Abigail Williams, among them, either disappeared into obscurity or tried to rebuild their lives under the weight of history. Ann Putnam Jr., in a moment of rare courage, would later stand before her congregation and publicly apologize for her role. She confessed that she had been deluded by Satan and begged forgiveness from those she had wronged. Her contrition, though sincere, could not undo the damage, but it stood as one of the few moments of direct accountability in a village where many had chosen silence over confession. As the years passed, Salem's name became a shorthand for miscarriage of justice. Travelers spoke of it in hushed tones. Writers used it as a warning. Even colonial authorities, long eager to forget, found it impossible to erase the event's stain. Massachusetts government passed compensation acts and began the slow, inconsistent process of restoring reputations. But full exoneration came only centuries later. And yet, even as the tragedy faded into history, its themes endured. The mechanisms of fear, power, and silence did not vanish. They merely changed form. The same human impulses that had ignited the trials, the need for order, the fear of difference, the comfort of scapegoating remained etched into the cultural memory. The Salem witch trials were never just about witches. They were about belief and the consequences of belief. They were about how societies police their boundaries, spiritual, social, and legal, and what happens when those boundaries become weapons. They were about how fear can overwhelm reason, and how justice, once corrupted, is nearly impossible to recover. Despite its historical distance, the story of Salem continued to echo in the lives of its descendants. In the decades following the trials, Salem became more than a location on a map. It was a symbol etched into the American consciousness. The phrase witch hunt entered the lexicon, invoked any time fear trumped fairness or suspicion replaced evidence. The psychological aftermath reached generations not even born at the time. Oral traditions in families kept the memory alive, some with shame, others with silent pride. It was not uncommon for descendants to conceal their relation to the accused or the accusers. Others found new purpose in genealogical research and historical preservation, determined to uncover the truth behind the hysteria. In time, their work would shed light on forgotten names and restore dignity to the dead. Salem's topography bore witness to these changing tides. Gallows Hill, once a site of fear, became a quiet memorial. The jail where accused witches had wasted away was torn down and but the land remembered. Locals reported strange feelings near the old sites. Not of ghosts or curses, but of collective mourning, a heaviness rooted in memory. Historians of the 18th and 19th centuries treated the Salem trials as an unfortunate footnote. It was not until the Romantic era, and then later during America's literary renaissance, that writers began to explore the deeper meaning of what had transpired. Nathaniel Hawthorne, a descendant of Judge Hawthorne, carried the legacy like a shadow. His works, most notably The Scarlet Letter, wrestled with the consequences of public shame, moral certainty, and inherited guilt. In the centuries that followed, new generations of Americans found relevance in Salem's story. During the Red Scare of the 1950s, Arthur Miller's The Crucible recasts the witch trials as an allegory for McCarthyism. Its characters and conflicts resonated with an America once again gripped by fear and accusation. Suddenly, a story of 1692 found fresh urgency, a warning about group authoritarianism and the fragility of justice. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Salem had embraced its dual legacy. It was a place of tourism, filled with museums, reenactments, and walking tours. But it was also a place of scholarship. Universities, historical societies, and activists collaborated to deepen public understanding, moving beyond sensationalism to honor the real victims. One of the most profound changes came through education. School curricula began to include Salem not merely as a strange episode, but as a case study in ethics, governance, and psychology. Students were asked not just to memorize dates or names, but to grapple with the questions the trials posed. How do communities break down? What fuels moral panics? Who is responsible when justice fails? The answers varied, but the conversations mattered. In recent years, the question of reparations returned. Some descendants called for formal apologies. Others asked that exonerations be expanded, or that new memorials be constructed. Massachusetts had already made several gestures, pardons, plaques, proclamations, but critics argued these were too little, too late. Still, each effort marked progress, a recognition that history cannot be rewritten, but it can be acknowledged. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy of Salem is its continuing ability to provoke reflection. Whether studied by legal scholars, theologians, psychologists, or artists, the trials endure not because they are unique, but because they are universal. The forces at play, fear, conformity, belief, and betrayal, are not bound to one century or continent. In every era, in every generation, someone points a finger. In some ways, Salem never left 1692. Though centuries passed, the foundational questions it raised about the nature of fear, justice, and power remained painfully relevant. New tragedies and new persecutions echoed the same structure. Mass suspicion, moral outrage, the erosion of due process, and the silencing of dissent. Historians drew parallels to the internment of Japanese Americans, the McCarthy hearings, the AIDS, panic, and even post-9/11's policies. In each case, Salem's shadow flickered. In literature and media, the image of the witch was real, no longer only the shrieking hag of colonial imagination. The witch became a symbol of feminine power, independence, and resistance. Books, plays, and television series reinterpreted the Salem women not as villains, but as victims. Pop culture rebranded the tragedy into both a cautionary tale and a platform for reclamation. Yet in academic circles, the focus turned more granular. Scholars analyzed the demographic data of the accused and the accusers. Patterns emerged. Many accused were women over the age of 40, often widowed or unmarried, and frequently in possession of property. Others were socially marginal, outspoken, or economically independent, traits that subtly threatened the prevailing patriarchal order. The trials became a case study in gendered power. The women of Salem were silenced in court, their bodily expressions used against them, their reputations dissected by men in robes. The courtroom became an arena where gender, class, and religion collided. Even when confessions were extracted, they were filtered through the expectations of male interrogators. At the same time, the role of children in the trial sparked intense inquiry. What drove the girls to convulsions and cries of spectral torment? Were they caught in a performance that spun out of control? Victims of mass hysteria? Manipulated by adults? Theories abounded. Neurological, psychological, sociopolitical, each offering insight but no single answer. This ambiguity became part of Salem's Unlike clear-cut historical episodes, the witch trials defied easy No single villain, only a system of suspicion and fear that implicated nearly everyone. The ambiguity demanded engagement, not closure. In Salem today, tourists walk cobbled streets with cameras in hand. They visit the witch house, the memorial at Proctor's Ledge, and the Salem Witch Museum. Some wear costumes, others carry guidebooks. There is a tension between solemn remembrance and spectacle, between honoring the dead and commercializing their suffering. Yet even amid the theatrics, moments of truth emerge. In candlelit ceremonies and whispered tours, in the quiet reading of names etched in granite, the humanity of the lost stills. The city has embraced its role as both cautionary landmark and cultural mirror. Each Halloween season brings crowds, but it also brings conversations. Panels, exhibits, and forums invite visitors to reflect on the real history beneath the myths. It is imperfect, but it is progress, an ongoing negotiation between memory and meaning. As the 400th anniversary of the trials approaches, renewed calls have emerged for deeper introspection. Academics urge not just commemoration, but curriculum reform. Activists suggest new monuments, new voices, new modes of storytelling. Descendants of the accused and the accusers meet at reconciliation events, sometimes speaking for the first time. Museums expand their archives, scholars digitize documents, communities lean toward acknowledgement. And through it all, Salem endures, not as a town trapped in the past, but as a living text, one written in names, blood, silence, and eventual apology. It reminds us that justice, once lost, is hard to restore, that belief without evidence is a knife with no hilt, that the gravest tragedies often begin with whispers, and that in every crowd, there is someone pointing a finger.